In this video, we're going to learn how to diagram extended arguments. And really what that means is mapping out the structure of the arguments. And there's a few things that we'll want to know on the topic of diagramming extended arguments. First, you should know the point, why it is that we want to engage in this practice. And then we need to know the kinds of diagramming patterns and what they're telling us, because it's going to be a visual cue that is representing certain information to us, and in order to diagram correctly, you'll need to know what it is that the diagram is actually trying to say to us, what it's trying to tell us. And then it turns out that at least in my experience, students have a particularly hard time diagramming extended arguments. So I want to go through several practice examples to help you get a firmer grip on how to go about doing this. So why diagram arguments? What's the purpose for us to be diagramming arguments? So we're in the business of analyzing arguments, and we want to analyze arguments for the purpose of determining whether they're truth-preserving or not. That is, to determine whether they even stand the chance of being convincing or don't even stand that chance and can just be completely ignored. And on our way to doing that, we've been laying the foundation. At least that's what we've been up to at this point. And that has included looking at the concrete parts of the arguments. So that was that would include the premises and the conclusion. But then you'll remember that there is this inferential move between the premises and the conclusion, and that's what we're really trying to focus on. And part of us focusing on that has been was the discussion of validity and invalidity and strength and weak arguments. And basically those were the concepts, specific concepts of truth preservation as they pertain to deductive arguments and inductive arguments, respectively. And now we want to continue getting a feel for these inferential moves. And what we do with these, while diagramming these arguments, is we're mapping out how those inferential moves are made. What kind of support are we getting from maybe a premise or sets of premise to an inference, and then how that inference might even be support for another inference until you finally get to your conclusion. And in doing so, in mapping these arguments and diagramming them, we, metaphorically speaking, we get a better sense of how they flow. That is, we get a better sense of the structure, and in doing that, you'll better appreciate why you're supposed to be why you are purportedly to be convinced by the argument, why it's supposed to lead you to the conclusion. And in that way, it'll help you also to better determine whether you should be convinced of the conclusion. So to get that point across, let's take a look at the argument that we have here in front of us. So in some ways, the argument we have here is relatively simple, but in some ways it's a little bit more complicated than the arguments we've seen before. But let's take a look at it. It says, "It's really cold outside. That's what the weather person said. So you had better wear your coat, Jimmy. You know how you always get sick if you get too cold. Without your coat, you'll surely get too cold. You'll get sick. And if you get sick, you're going to miss seeing your favorite band." So some of the argumentation in this particular argument is implicit, but let's start thinking through what's happening. So if we slow down and think through. Our first sentence says it's really cold outside. And the very next clause or sentence says, "That's what the weather person said." And if we think about those two sentences in connection together, then we'll see that this sentence is reason to believe that this sentence is true. How do I know that it's really cold outside? An expert told me so, right? That's the main thought that's taking place here. And so that tells us that this is supposed to be acting as if this was just an argument itself, right? If we just thought of these two sentences themselves as being one argument, this would be the premise, and this would be the conclusion, which tells us that this is an inference from what the weather person told us. All right, so let's set that aside then for the moment and look at the next sentence. It says, "So you had better wear your coat, Jimmy." The word "so" here is a conclusion indicator, or we can also think about it as being an inference indicator. So it does tell us that this sentence is supposed to follow from some other premise or some other statement. And if I left the rest of the argument that follows, it's really cold outside, that's what the weather person said, so you'd better wear your coat, Jimmy. Some of the background information that we know about it being cold, that typically we don't like being really cold, it would be reasonable to interpret this as being a conclusion just from it being really cold outside, right? And so the way the argument would proceed is, this would tell you that this is true, and then this statement would be what's suggesting that this is true. But let's go on, because the argument is a little bit more complex than that, as we'll see. So in continuing on, it says, "You know how you always get sick if you get too cold." So notice, if you get too cold, that's going to guarantee getting sick. And what we got with our inference here is that it's really cold. So this, we know it's cold outside. So we know that there's the risk of getting too cold. And that means we're going to get sick. Well, here's a way of preventing yourself from getting cold. Without your coat, you'll surely get too cold. So a coat can help prevent that. Right? We'll get too cold. So there's when we get to this point where it says you'll get sick, there's an implicit part, which is you'll get sick without your coat. So that's really what we're conveying. It's kind of hard to pick up, but let's put a star by this. That's a terrible star. Hold on. Here we go. So what are we really saying? You'll get sick without your coat, or without your coat you'll get sick. Get sick without a coat. And so why do we know that's true? Well, it's these two sentences working together. Without a coat, you'll get too cold. If you get too cold, you're going to get sick. Right? That's really what we call a hypothetical syllogism. It's not obvious that that's what's happening here, but that is what's taking place. So if you don't have a coat, then you'll get sick. And then we find out if you get sick, you're going to miss your favorite band. So going on with, basically we have another hypothetical syllogism where these two pieces of information working together tell us that without a coat, what's going to happen? You're going to miss your favorite band. And that's because it's really cold outside, right? And presumably, because we really don't want to miss our favorite band, we don't want this to happen, missing our favorite band. We had better do the thing that's going to prevent that. So we know that it's cold outside. So we know that this can be true. It can be true that we can get too cold. But there's this way to prevent that. Why do we want to prevent that? Well, eventually we'll find out, because you'll miss your favorite band if you don't, right? Because you'll get sick if you don't, and then if you're sick, you're going to miss seeing your favorite band. That would be terrible. Well, we need to make sure to do the thing that could prevent that. We need to make sure to wear a coat. So breaking that up into the various pieces, we see that the information is working together in relatively complex ways to get us to the conclusion. And when we diagram the arguments, that's going to allow us to reveal what that structure looks like. And so let's turn our attention to learning what that diagramming is, what the patterns of diagramming are, and what it represents to us. All right, so we're going to look at the argument patterns. And while we're looking at these argument patterns, we should keep in mind that each of these patterns is representing something to us. It's representing information. And when we're making these patterns, we're removing the content in this, trying to leave the structure left over. So we're removing, to be a little morbid, I suppose, we're removing the flesh and trying to leave the skeleton or the bones of the argument. And what will be represented, what's supposed to be left over in terms of what's being represented, is how the truth of statements is supposed to flow from one statement to another, and eventually bottoming out into the conclusion. So let's take a look at this. With that in mind, let's take a look at this vertical pattern and see what it's supposed to represent to us. All right, so our argument says, one, that cat, right, that cat over there, that cat is used to dogs. As a result, two, she won't be upset if you bring home a dog for a pet. One of the things that should stand out to us is as a result, because that's a conclusion indicator or an inference indicator, telling us that claim 2, we're supposed to accept that to be true because of some other claim. The only other claim to even consider in this case is 1. And of course, if we think about the information contained in 1, it just is the kind of information that would suggest that 2 is true, right? If the cat in question, is okay around dogs because it's used to dogs, then that cat's not going to be upset when you get a pet dog, or any other time that it's around a dog. So what that means then is this sentence the truth of this sentence, if it's true, is supposed to suggest that this is true. And the way that we diagram that, with this vertical diagram, we take the premise, or whatever statement that's supposed to be well, in this case, the premise, but from which the inference is supposed to follow from, we put that at the top. So that starts up above, and then the inference comes below. And in a simple case like this, we have one arrow. One is supposed to suggest that 2 is true. So one thing to keep in mind then when considering what this represents, truth flows downwards. So the person that's asserting this argument is saying, look, 1 is true, therefore you should accept 2 to be true. Let's look at the next pattern. The next pattern we're going to look at is called the horizontal pattern. And so let's take a look at the argument in question in learning about this pattern. So it says you should eat cottage cheese often. It will help you to be slender. It will help you remain youthful. It will help make your skin even more beautiful. So if we think about the information that's contained in statements 2, 3, and 4, each of those statements are the kinds of things that would suggest that you ought to eat cottage cheese, insofar as we take being slender to be good, that we take youthful to being good, and that we take our skin to be even more beautiful to be a good thing. So insofar as those are good things, each of those suggests that one is true. And notice that even if we took 3 and 4 away, if somebody just said you should eat cottage cheese often, it'll help you be slender, and let's assume for the moment, and maybe it's a faulty assumption, but let's assume for the moment that being slender is a good thing, then that all by itself would suggest that you should eat cottage cheese is true. That is, it would be evidence all on its own. Whether it be enough evidence, that's a different story, but it would be evidence all by itself. And the same thing with 3, if we took 2 and 4 away. So if we just think about it will help you remain youthful, if that's presumably a good thing, I'm going to assert that it is a good thing now that I'm getting older myself. That would be evidence that you should eat cottage cheese. Same thing with if we get rid of 2 and 3 and all we have is 4. The fact that it would make your skin even more beautiful would all by itself be evidence that you ought to eat cottage cheese often. So as I have here, what you should be noting is that each of those reasons offer independent evidence, independent in the sense that they don't require the help of the information of the other statements to get you to the conclusion, to 1. Now, they are working together in the sense that they're all being piled on top of 1, right? It would be like giving, you might do a simple type of reasoning task, deciding whether you want to eat cottage cheese or not, where you just list all the pros and the cons, and you try to think about whether the pros outweigh the cons. Well, 2, 3, and 4 would be stacking more and more, metaphorically speaking, stacking more weight in the favor of eating cottage cheese, but not because the fact that it would make you slender requires it to also make you remain youthful in order for it to count as evidence. Even if you didn't have the fact that it would help you to remain youthful, it would still be evidence all by itself. So that's what we mean by independent reasons. And that will get contrasted. You'll probably come to better appreciate that as we look at premises that do work together, that work jointly together, conjointly. So the way that we diagram this then is each of the pieces of information, each of the statement that is supposed to be independent evidence for a conclusion, we list those horizontally on the same level, right? So it's like taking several vertical ones, but we're not going to stack each of these on top of each other, because if we did, suppose we tried to diagram it this way. This says, for the fact that it'll help you make your skin even be more beautiful, this being true makes it likely to be true that it'll help you be more slender. And that it being more slender is what's going to make it true, or should make you believe that it'll be true, that it'll help you remain youthful. But that's not, even if those things are true, note that that's not what the person is trying to do in this argument. The person's not trying to say 4 is going to get you to 2. The fact that it's going to make you more beautiful is going to make you more youthful. The fact that it's more youthful, it's going to make you more youthful or remain youthful, it's going to make you more slender. That's not the way that this argument is structured. Rather, each of these, 2, 3, and 4, are supposed to be evidence going directly to 1. So it'd be wrong to try to diagram it in a series of vertical inferences. That would be very misleading. All right, now we're going to take a look at the conjoint premises pattern. And to have the conjoint premises pattern, you're going to need at least 2 premises to be involved, because we use the conjoint symbol when premises work together in a substantial way, such that you're not going to get to the inference. The inference would be very uncompelling if you were, it's not just uncompelling, it'd be pretty much a non sequitur. It just wouldn't follow if you were to remove one of those premises in question. So let's look at this argument to get a sense of what I mean by that. So 1, when blue jays are breeding, they become very aggressive. 2, scrub jays are quite similar in temperament to blue jays. In light of this evidence, scrub jays can be expected to be aggressive when breeding. So, one of the things that should jump out to us is that in light of this evidence is telling us that 1 and 2 are pieces of evidence, and they're pieces of evidence then for 3. So basically this is a conclusion indicator, right? In light of this evidence is a conclusion indicator for 3. And let's see now why that is. We're told that, let's take this backwards. So we're told that scrub jays and blue jays are very similar in temperament. So that tells us, however blue jays turn out, then we can expect scrub jays to turn out that way too, in terms of temperament. So if we leave out 1, that means we wouldn't know what the temperament of blue jays is. Right? We wouldn't know whether they're aggressive. We wouldn't have that information. We wouldn't know whether they're aggressive or passive, or whatever other degree you might have on that scale. And since we wouldn't know that, we can't just move from statement 2, from claim 2, to statement 3. That'd be a very, very odd, very poor inference for somebody to make. In fact, if somebody tried to make that argument to you, you should probably be like, wait, what? I don't understand. Why? Or what you might do, you might take these as the premises if somebody did that, and then make the inference that they're apparently aggressive. Okay. Likewise, if we take out statement 2 and we look at 1, it says when blue jays are breeding, they become very aggressive. And then we try to conclude from that scrub jays can be expected to be aggressive when breeding. Well, why would we think that's true just because blue jays are aggressive, right? It would be very odd to say that when blue jays are breeding, they become very aggressive. Therefore, when finches are breeding, they become very aggressive. Or, what's a non-aggressive bird, like a parakeet, right? Something like a parakeet. No, that's bizarre. And so that would be a bad inference. And it's a bad inference here, too, unless we have claim 2. Unless we have that additional information that they are quite similar in temperament. So the fact that 1 and 2 are working together in this substantial kind of way, in this way that you're not going to get to the conclusion, you're not going to get to the inference without one of the other premises, what we do is we put them in a bracket together. So if they're working independently, like adding one pro after another pro after another pro for thinking that something is true, then we get the horizontal pattern. But that's not a good way of diagramming this case, because these are actually working together to get us to the to get us to the conclusion. So the last pattern that we're going to look at is the multiple conclusion pattern. So sometimes in an argument that someone gives, they'll provide you with a premise that is supposed to suggest not just one other statement to be true, but multiple statements to be true, so 2 or more. So here, just to give you an example, we have it is raining outside, so you should bring your umbrella and shouldn't wear open-toed shoes. So the conclusion indicator should jump out to you. So we know that what's coming after here is supposed to be a conclusion. And if we think about the argument as a whole, we'll notice that the conclusion, this indicator, is in some sense implicit with the and after here. And that doesn't always have to be the case, but it is the case here. And what that tells us is it is raining outside. This is supposed to suggest that this is true, and at the same time it's supposed to suggest that this is true. Right? And if we think about it being raining outside and the general background information that we don't like to get wet, at least in most instances or most cases, then we can appreciate that this just is the kind of information that would suggest either of these being true. So the way that we represent when the truth of one statement is supposed to suggest more than just one statement to be true, we give this little bracket here and put the inferences or the statements that are supposed to follow, that are supposed to be suggested true because of the statement up here. So in this case, that would be 2 and 3. I want to take a look at several diagramming problems, so several arguments that we need to diagram correctly. And the reason why I want to do that is, in my experience, students tend to find these to be pretty challenging. If you think about the patterns that we've looked at independently, any given pattern itself doesn't seem to be too challenging, I don't think. But all of those patterns can be used together in combination. So it's not like any given argument you'll only find one of those patterns. Instead, those patterns can be used to be built on one another and eventually leading down to the conclusion. So basically, as the arguments that we come across become more complex, the more difficult that this is. The other reason why I think it's that students find it challenging is the students maybe aren't paying close attention to what the diagram is supposed to be signifying. And again, it's really trying to signify how the truth is supposed to flow from one statement to another. So if you keep in mind that those arrows that are coming down, it's trying to say, the arrow is trying to communicate, hey, this statement up here, the reason why since it is true, you're supposed to believe this statement down here to be true. And then what the brackets are telling us is these premises are working together and to get to the statement, to suggest that the statement is true. And if they weren't working together, then you would really not be impressed. It would be really out of place to suggest that it's true. And then the other bracket for conclusions, it tells you that there's more than one statement that's we're being told is true because of another statement. But if you keep in mind, I think if you keep in mind those facts, what those symbols are supposed to be communicating to us, and that the truth is supposed to flow downward, that can really aid you in diagramming correctly. But let's turn our attention to the argument that we have in front of us, and I'll just read it off here, let you pause the video and take a moment of trying to diagram it yourself, how you think it should be diagrammed, and then I'll go through the diagram, how it ought to be diagrammed, and explain why. So our argument says, I prefer the steak to the lobster at this restaurant because 2, they tend to overcook the seafood. I guess that also means that 3, I would prefer the lamb to the salmon here. Let's go ahead and pause the video and try to diagram this. All right, so let's take a look at how this argument should be diagrammed. Let's see here. So it should be diagrammed in the following way. Now, why is that? Well, one of the things that hopefully jumped out to you, in claim 1 it says, I prefer the steak to the lobster at this restaurant because. So this is a premise indicator suggesting that what follows is going to be a premise. So I prefer the steak to the lobster at this restaurant because they tend to overcook the seafood. So the fact that it's true that they overcook the seafood suggests that you don't want the seafood and would prefer something other than a lobster being, of course, an item of seafood. So you'd prefer the steak over the lobster. So 2 suggests that 1 could be true, that 1 ought to be true. But then we say afterwards, I guess that also means, right, and this also is kind of informing us that, hey, there's another inference, right? It also tells us something else to be true, namely I would prefer the lamb to the salmon here. So this reason tells me that I prefer the steak over the lobster, but it also tells me I prefer the lamb to the salmon. So we have multiple inferences from one statement, right? And when that happens, we take the multiple inferences, the multiple statements being inferred, and we put them in the box. So that's 1 and 3. The truth flows downward, so we put what they're supposed to follow from up top. So we put 2 as the premise. All right, so let's look at the following argument and see how it should be diagrammed. So it says, without a tax increase, there will be runaway inflation. Congress refuses to raise taxes. As a result, it looks like there will be runaway inflation. In light of this, you should borrow money now, since this is always a good idea when inflation is looming. Now, this argument is more complicated, more complex than the other arguments that we've seen while looking at the different patterns of diagramming. And I'll give you a hint when you're thinking about diagramming this on your own. You're going to have to use combinations of the different of the types of patterns, right? You're going to have to work them together in combinations to get the right diagram. So go ahead and pause the video, try to work it out the best you can, and then I'll reveal the correct diagram and then talk about why it's the correct diagram. Okay, let's take a look at how this argument is to be diagrammed. It should be diagrammed in the following way. And let's take a look at why that's the case. So our argument says without a tax increase, there will be runaway inflation. And the second statement says Congress refuses to raise taxes. Notice even if you didn't have 3 stated, and even if you didn't have this conclusion indicator, just by this information alone, because you know if Congress refuses to raise taxes, then there won't be a tax increase. Then, since there's not going to be, right, this tells us if you don't get a tax increase, there's going to be runaway inflation. 2, Congress refuses to, so you're not going to get a tax increase. Therefore, what? Therefore, you're going to get runaway inflation. So that covers this portion of the diagram. And notice that if you only had the information without a tax increase, there'll be runaway inflation, but you don't know what Congress is going to do, then you can't get to 3. 3 would be a very odd inference to try to make from 1 alone. And the same thing with 2. If we take out without a tax increase, there'll be runaway inflation, right? If we remove this, and all we know is that Congress refuses to raise taxes, but we don't know what that has to do with inflation one way or the other, then still it would be odd to say it looks like there'll be runaway inflation. But with those both together, it does follow that there would be runaway inflation. Then as we move on in the argument, let me get rid of these. Okay. But then as we move along in the argument, we get in light of this. Well, in light of what? What is this picking out? The runaway inflation, right? So in light of the fact that we're going to have runaway inflation, you should borrow money now. Why? Because, or since, right, and this is a premise indicator, this is always a good idea when inflation is looming. So in light of this, in light of 3, you should borrow money now. Because when you have runaway inflation, it's always a good idea to borrow money when there's going to be inflation. So then notice that 3, even though it was inferred from 1 and 2 together, now is working with 5 together. Because if all you knew, right, if we didn't have the inference, if we didn't have 3, and all we know that it's always a good idea to borrow money when inflation is looming, that's not yet going to tell you that you need to borrow money, because you don't know whether you're going to have runaway inflation yet, right? In the near future, you don't know. Likewise, if you were to get rid of 5, you're not going to be able to infer from 3 that it looks like there'll be runaway inflation, that you should borrow money now, because we don't have the information that that's a good time, that it's always a good time, but that's a good time to then borrow money. So again, they need to be working together, which is why we have the brackets. And then this leads, or this talks about this part of the diagram, or corresponds to this part of the diagram. So first we get a sub-argument. Let me back this up again. Use a different color. So we have a sub-argument where 1 and 2 work together to get us to 3. And then the inference made by this sub-argument here then forms another sub-argument that gets us to the last inference, our main conclusion. And then those sub-arguments together work together, forming our whole argument. Here's another argument. It says the man who broke into this warehouse must have been rather large. His footprints sink at least an inch into this dry soil. His footprints are of size 22 EEE, and moreover, we can see by where he bumped his head on this rafter that he is at least 7 feet tall. So go ahead and pause and try diagramming this the way that you think that it should be diagrammed. Okay, let's take a look at how this should be diagrammed. So here we have a horizontal pattern, and let's think about why that's the case. So notice that we're told that the man who broke we're first told the man who broke into this warehouse must have been rather large, and everything afterwards is the kind of information that would suggest that the person is large. So that's what informs us that this is our conclusion. And since it's 1 and it's the conclusion, or the inference, in this case both the inference and the conclusion, it gets put down here at the bottom. Now notice that these claims, so the fact that this person is sinking into the dry soil by an inch, and has 22 EEE size shoes and bumped a head, and so must be 7 feet tall. All of this information is working together to get us to 1, but it's working together in that same way that the pros, when you're doing the pro-con type of thing, it's adding more and more weight. It's piling on to 1. It's not working together in the same way that the blue jay and scrub jay example work together. And that's because even if I were to eliminate 3, and even if I eliminated 4, if somebody is sinking an inch into dry soil, that suggests that's a fairly large, big individual, right? Sinking into wet soil, no big deal. It happens to toddlers. But dry soil, whoa, must be a really big person. even if you didn't have that other information, it would still suggest that the person is rather large. Or, I don't even know what to compare size 22 EEE shoes, but that would be huge, right? And the fact that this person has huge feet suggests, again, that the person's rather large. You know, rather large or really funny looking, but probably rather large. And again, right, if we still got rid of, or if we got rid of both 2 and 3, and we find out that the person is 7 foot tall, that suggests that person's rather large. That we're probably talking about a big person here. Right, none of these, it may be 4 especially, and 3 too, not definitive evidence for one, but it is evidence for one, and it's evidence for one independent, right? It would be evidence for claim 1 even if the other claims weren't there. And that's why we get the horizontal pattern, right? Here going horizontal across instead of them working together. All right, if we were to remove one of these and then suddenly we could tell that we wouldn't be able to get to, or wouldn't have any evidence really getting us to claim 1, then we need to group them together like this with the bracket. But since we didn't, we get the horizontal pattern instead. All right, let's take a look at another argument. So this says we should not pay Adam an allowance because he never does any work around the house, and he would probably just waste the allowance money given that he has no concept of value of anything. So go ahead and pause the video and try diagramming this argument yourself, and then we'll compare it to how it should be diagrammed, and I'll talk about why it should be diagrammed that way. All right, so let's take a look at what we have here. Here is our following pattern, and before even getting into the argument, notice that we have a horizontal pattern here, and we have a vertical pattern here. So we have a combination of a vertical pattern and a horizontal pattern. So our argument says we should not pay Adam an allowance because he never does any work around the house. So because, of course, is a premise indicator, and what the because tells us is that 2 is going to be one of the reasons why we should think that 1 is true, and that's what we have represented here. The truth of 2 flows down to 1. That's why we should think that 1 is true. Because he never does any work around the house, and so this because, the way that this is structured, and again, it takes some insight to see this, but the way that this is structured is the because is in some sense getting pushed into this and. So it's like saying because 2, he never does any work around the house, and because he would probably just waste the money, the allowance money, given that he has no concept of the value of anything. So that and because, the implicit because here, tells us that, again, we have what would be another vertical pattern, but since we have two statements leading directly to 1 as independent information, we get it diagrammed this way. And then if we, one way to see that too, by the way, is to think about the information that we're given. So in 2, we're told he never does any work around the house. Well, that's the kind of reason we would appeal to in not paying somebody an allowance, right? You're not doing the stuff you're supposed to be doing. And then he would probably just waste the allowance. that's also another reason to not give somebody money. If you're just going to waste it, why? It would then I in turn would be right. The parents in turn would be wasting it by giving it to this child, presumably child because he has no concept of the value of anything. And the fact that you have no concept of the value of anything is what suggests that you're going to waste the allowance money, because you won't put the appropriate value on it, and you'll buy things that you shouldn't, right? So 4 is supposed to tell us that 3 is true, and then 3 is supposed to tell us that 1 is true, and 2 is also supposed to tell us that 1 is true. And the reason why these aren't, let me get rid of some of these circles. So you might ask yourself, well, why aren't these put in brackets? Well, they're not put in brackets because even if this part of the argument was completely removed, the fact that he doesn't do any work around the house all by itself would be the kind of reason not to give Adam an allowance, right? You don't need 3 for 2 to get you to 1. Likewise, if you remove this and all it said was we should not pay Adam an allowance because he'd probably just waste the allowance, the fact that he would waste the allowance is all by itself the kind of information that would lead you to 1. So you wouldn't need to. So these aren't working together in that substantial kind of way. They're only working together in the pro-con kind of way where you're just adding weights on one another. All right, this argument says professional boxing should be outlawed. Boxing almost always leads to brain damage, and anything that leads to brain damage ought to be done away with. Besides, it supports organized crime, and anything that supports organized crime should be outlawed. So pause the video and try diagramming this argument, and then we'll talk about it. Let's take a look at how the argument's supposed to be diagrammed. So here's our diagram. And let's talk about it very briefly before getting back through the argument. So notice that we have conjoint premises both here and here. And the fact that they're set next to each other tells us that these conjoint premises are sitting or are situated in a horizontal pattern. So we have the combination of a horizontal pattern with, instead of just one premise here, like one statement here and one statement here, we have the conjoint statement and conjoint statement. And then what that tells us even further is that this is independent. 2 and 3 working together is independently working to 1 from 4 and 5 working together to getting us to 1. So let me say that again and maybe use different words. So 2 and 3, the information contained is going to be by itself enough to suggest that 1 is true. And then in the same kind of pro-con kind of way that we've been talking about, so adding up a bunch of pros or adding up a bunch of cons, we additionally have 4 and 5 all by itself, right? 4 and 5 working together, but independently of 2 and 3, getting us to 1 being true. All right, so with that in mind, let's take a look at what the argument is saying. So our first statement, professional boxing should be outlawed. If we think about the information that comes afterwards, it's just the kind of information that would suggest that 1 is true. So that suggests that 1 is our conclusion, And that's why we have it at the bottom, because that's what we're trying to prove, and truth flows downwards. Ooh. All right. So then we're told that boxing almost always leads to brain damage, and anything that leads to brain damage ought to be done away with. So we're told that all things that lead to brain damage are the kinds of things that should be done away with. We're also told that boxing practically always does lead to brain damage. So given that both 2 and 3 is true, if that turns out to be true, then we should get rid of professional boxing. That is, we should outlaw it. But notice that if we take away 2, and all we know is anything that leads to brain damage ought to be done away with, we don't have enough information to suggest that it should be true that we should get rid of boxing, that boxing should be outlawed. It's only until we know that it's the kind of thing that does lead to brain damage. Same if we leave 2 but got rid of 3. So we know that boxing almost always leads to brain damage, but unless we know that that's something that should be, that brain damage is the kind of thing, well, things that lead to brain damage are the kinds of things that should be done away with, then we don't know yet that professional boxing should be outlawed. So we can't get to 1 unless we have both 2 and 3, and that's why we get the brackets here for 2 and 3, because they're working together to get us to 1. But this portion of the argument would be enough to get us to 1, even if 4 and 5 never occurred in the argument. And that's why these get separated out. That's why there's space in between. Let me use a different color. That's why there's space between these guys. Because even though 2 and 3 rely on each other to get 1, and 4 and 5 rely on each other to get to 1, these don't rely on each other. Right? We don't have that happening here. And then we can see as we move to the next portion of the argument, where it says, besides it, namely professional boxing, supports organized crime, and anything that supports organized crime should be outlawed. Well, that's the very same kind of reasoning that we just got in 2 and 3, right? It's just different content, but it's the same pattern of reasoning. And so not surprisingly, we see that 4 and 5 have to work together. If I take out that professional boxing supports organized crime, well, it's not enough to know that anything that supports organized crime should be outlawed, that's going to lead it to being true that professional boxing should be outlawed. It's only until I also know that professional boxing supports organized crime. And the same over here, if we leave 4 but we get rid of 5, it's not yet clear that because it supports organized crime, that professional boxing should be outlawed. There might be all sorts of things that support organized crime, right? Like funny, as funny as it is, there's apparently a black market for maple syrup. Well, should we outlaw maple syrup, even though maple syrup seems to support organized crime? Right? So that's not clear. I will admit it gives some support by itself, right? But notice, once you're told that all things that support organized crime should be outlawed, once you're given that in conjunction to this, man, these together guarantee that professional boxing should be outlawed. And that's why they get the brackets. That's why they should be joined together. Let's take a look at one more argument. All right, our argument tells us anything that is worth recording has been entered in the ship's log. As a result, I'm pretty sure that no one on my ship has ever seen a mermaid. For seeing a mermaid would be a huge deal, and as you can see, there is no record in my log of anyone's ever having seen one. So go ahead and pause the video, try your hand at diagramming this argument, then I'll reveal how it should be diagrammed and I'll talk about it. All right, let's take a look at how this argument should be diagrammed. So here we have an interesting case where three of the statements are working conjointly together to get us to the conclusion. So our argument tells us that anything that is worth recording, so all things that are worth recording, are things that have been entered into the ship's log. So that tells us that if something was worth recording, it's got to be in the ship's log. Then we find ourselves with a conclusion indicator. So as a result, I'm pretty sure that no one on my ship has ever seen a mermaid. So because of one, and then for some other reasons, we're going to get to 2 being the conclusion. So that's why 2 is at the bottom here. The truth is flowing from these other reasons to 2. All right, so all things that are worth recording are things that have been entered into the ship's log. That's what 1 tells us. And then we're told that seeing a mermaid would be a huge deal. That is, right, and that's another way of saying it would be the kind of thing that would be worth recording. But as you can see, there is no record in my log of anyone's ever having seen one. So what's going on? A mermaid would be the kind of thing that would be worth recording, and anything that is worth recording has been entered in the ship logs. So if those are true, right? If this is true and this is true, then when we look in the ship log, there's got to be a record of seeing a mermaid. But when we look at it in the log, we don't see that. Therefore, it can't be that anyone on the ship has ever seen a mermaid. If you take out any one of these pieces of information, so if all you know that seeing a mermaid would be a huge deal, but there's no record in my log of anyone's ever having seen one, you can't get to 2 because you don't know that just because something's a huge deal, it would be the kind of thing that gets into the log. Or if you got rid of 3, if seeing a mermaid was a everyday occurrence, then just because an everyday occurrence, it wouldn't be a huge deal. Just because anything that is worth recording has been entered in the ship's log and there's no record of anybody seeing a mermaid doesn't tell you that no one has. Right? Somebody may have, and it wasn't a huge deal, so they didn't enter it in the ship's log. Or if you say that anything that is worth recording has been entered in the ship's log, and seeing a mermaid would be a huge deal, you can't get to the conclusion that no one on the ship has ever seen a mermaid, because if you remove 4, maybe it is in the log, right? Maybe it is in the law. In which case, someone did see a mermaid. So that's why all of three of these have to work conjointly to get us to 2.